I pulled it off the internal grading system. Hargrove continued. I don't know how long I'll have access, but it's all there. Adjustments, overrides, internal notes. Not just yours. Dozens of students. Especially black students. Especially girls. The whole class went silent when Mr. Barrett ripped Zayden's perfect test in half and said, a janitor's kid doesn't score higher than legacy students. Cameras were rolling, students were laughing, until Zayden pulled out a second test untouched and slid it forward. Barrett's face froze, but what Zayden wrote next, no one saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late morning bell rang with its usual sharp authority, echoing through the spotless sunlit hallways of Clearbrook High, a school where even the lockers looked like they'd been polished daily. On most days, students strolled to class with coffee in hand, headphones in, and confidence inherited from zip codes that guaranteed second chances. But this morning something was different. Something unapproved had stepped through the doors of room 2. 16-year-old Zayden Brooks, tall for his age with quiet, watchful eyes, paused in the doorway of the honors calculus classroom. His backpack was faded, its zipper barely holding on, and his jeans had the faint chalk marks of cafeteria floors, leftover remnants from helping his mother mop them at 5 a.m. before school. The classroom, sleek with brushed steel desks and digital whiteboards, seemed to resist his presence like an immune system attacking an intruder. Every head turned. The rich kids in the front, the ones with Rolexes gifted at 14 and tennis scholarships already lined up, exchanged glances. A couple of them smirked. Others just looked confused. Sitting in that room meant something. Honors calculus wasn't just a class. It was a status symbol. Zayden's presence felt like graffiti on a marble statue. At the center of it all stood Mr. Barrett. Mr. Colin Barrett was a man who wore his entitlement like a designer suit. Always pressed, always smug, always 2 steps above everyone else in the room. Or so he believed. His tie was burgundy today, patterned with tiny gold fleur-de-lis that matched his cufflinks, subtle old money rebellion, in an otherwise standard dress code. Barrett had taught honors calculus for over 2 decades. His students went to Yale, to Stanford. His classes were not for experimentation, they were for legacies. As Zayden stepped forward, trying not to shrink under the weight of those stares, Barrett froze while scanning the printed class roster on his podium. He looked up, squinting at the boy like he was seeing a misprint in his own reality. Name? Barrett asked, tilting his head with the kind of condescension you'd use on a trespasser. Zayden Brooks, he said calmly. Barrett paused, eyes flicking back to the paper, then again to Zayden. A slow, almost rehearsed chuckle slipped from his lips. You must be lost. This isn't Algebra 1. The class chuckled, nervously at first, then a bit more freely. Zayden stood still, his expression unreadable. Barrett lifted his glasses onto the bridge of his nose and peered again. Yes, there it is. Zayden Brooks. Well, that's unexpected. Another ripple of laughter. Barrett leaned back against the desk and crossed his arms. You do understand this is calculus, right? Not basic arithmetic. Someone in the back whispered, maybe he's here to clean the boards. Another smirk followed. Zayden didn't respond. He walked to the back row, choosing the last desk near the window, and quietly took out a spiral notebook, its pages crinkled and worn from use. He placed a well-used pencil beside it, the eraser nearly gone. Barrett wasn't done. Well, I suppose you're here because someone thought diversity includes handing out challenges like candy. But I'll say this, calculus doesn't care who your mother is. It doesn't care what neighborhood you came from. This class separates the capable from the hopeful. The room went still. Even the laughter faded. Zayden didn't look up. Barrett, clearly satisfied that his warning had been delivered, moved to the whiteboard and began writing the syllabus. Behind him, Zayden flipped open his notebook. A girl 2 rows up turned around slightly, curiosity overtaking her disdain. What she saw on Zayden's page wasn't a sketch or a doodle. It was calculus, complex equations, limits, integrals, graphs with annotations, handwritten problems solved, line by line, cleaner than most students could type them. She frowned, then faced forward again, lips pressed tight. Minutes passed. Barrett, still riding the high of public dominance, walked the rows and handed out printed copies of the class expectations. His eyes flicked over each student until he reached Zayden. He lingered a second too long, then dropped the packet on Zayden's desk. I suggest you read that twice, he said, his voice low but audible. This class isn't for tourists. Zayden finally looked up, their eyes locked. And in that still thin moment of silence, Zayden said nothing. He didn't nod. He didn't flinch. He just stared, direct, unmoving, and entirely without fear. Barrett blinked first, but it wasn't over. At the end of the period, after going over the semester structure, Barrett gave the class a pre-test meant to gauge their summer retention. It wasn't graded, but the questions were brutal, designed to trap anyone who didn't belong. Most students groaned. Some sighed and rolled their eyes. Zayden took the paper quietly and began writing. What he wrote, however, wasn't simple answers. Each problem was broken down into clean, perfect steps. His handwriting was slow but exact. Integrals solved. Derivatives explained in annotation. Explanations appeared beside equations. Mini proofs for why the answer was what it was. On the back, where most students left blanks, Zayden filled in a secondary method of solving the most complex problem, just in case Barrett accused him of guessing. The girl in front of him noticed again. This time, her mouth opened slightly. 15 minutes in, Barrett noticed too. He walked over, casually peering over shoulders, correcting posture, offering smug encouragements. But when he reached Zayden, something shifted. He leaned in, frowning at the page. He stayed there longer than necessary. The numbers didn't lie. Zayden had not only solved the problems, he'd done so using alternate techniques even advanced students struggled to grasp. Barrett's face didn't change, but his eyes twitched. Just once. "Test's over in 5, he announced, walking away a bit too fast. When the bell rang, students gathered their things. Zayden stood, placed his test neatly atop the stack, and walked out without a word. The classroom buzzed. Whispers spread. That janitor kid? He wrote stuff Barrett didn't even teach yet. Barrett sat behind his desk, silent, his jaw clenched. He picked up Zayden's paper. Read the first problem.
Then the second.
By the third, his hand began to tremble slightly. He flipped the page. There it was, a solution he hadn't seen in years. One that was only taught in certain college seminars. And it was right. His eyes narrowed. No. There had to be an explanation. He opened the class roster again. Next to Zayden Brooks's name was a handwritten note. Transfer approved by District GPA 4.3. Gifted learner status confirmed. Barrett crushed the note in his hand. This wasn't over. Zayden opens his notebook, and what he writes stuns even Barrett. The quiet hum of the afternoon settled over Clearbrook High as students drifted into their next classes. But the tension from the morning still lingered in the air like humidity that refused to disperse. Zayden walked the hallway with his head lowered, replaying every stare, every suppressed laugh, every condescending pause from Mr. Barrett. The weight sat squarely between his shoulders, but he absorbed it with the same quiet endurance he had learned from years of watching his mother make herself small in spaces that demanded she disappear. Even as he moved, he kept thinking about the moment Barrett had stared at his notebook, and the undecipherable flicker in the teacher's voice, the strange hesitation that suggested something was shifting beneath the surface. Yet Zayden knew better than to hope that shift would be in his favor. Just around the corner, hidden from the polished sightlines of the wealthier students, Denise Brooks pushed a wide yellow mop bucket down the same corridors her son walked, as a newly admitted honors student. The wheels rattled softly, a familiar sound she had heard every weekday for 15 years. She knew every tile seam, every crack in the linoleum, every stain unable to be removed despite her efforts. Her hands bore faint chemical burns from years of scrubbing floors that never acknowledged her effort. Many of the teachers passed her with polite indifference, the same way one might avoid eye contact with a service worker they didn't want to seem rude to, but not enough to treat with full humanity either. It was the subtle hierarchy Clearbrook operated on. Respect was given freely, but dignity was rationed. Denise had learned to survive in the margins of that hierarchy, moving quietly through the building before dawn, sweeping up snack wrappers left by students whose futures were already mapped out with internships and legacy admissions. She often paused outside the very classrooms where she knew brilliant minds were shaped, silently wishing her son could enter those spaces without the barriers she had felt all her life. And today, for the first time, he had. Yet instead of pride, she felt a shadow of dread following her like a trailing echo. She sensed that stepping into a space reserved for privilege would not come without consequences. As she turned another corner, she heard her name whispered. Not the friendly sort of whisper, but the quick, clipped murmur of parents who believed their conversations mattered more than the ears of the people serving them. Two mothers from the PTO stood near a trophy case, their arms crossed tightly, their pearls angled toward each other like compass needles. Their words came out coated with sugar yet laced with steel. They admired Zayden's courage. They claimed, but wondered aloud if ambition was something that should be managed when a student's upbringing did not reflect the rigor expected of prestigious academic tracks. They mentioned Denise's position as if it were an inherited limitation, gesturing toward the mop bucket as though it were evidence of overstepping boundaries. Denise kept moving, her expression still, her pace steady. She had learned to let these moments slip over her like water on wax. But something inside her tightened anyway. She understood the coded language. She was never meant to rise, and her son was never meant to surpass. Yet she also remembered the way Zayden studied late into the night, his brow furrowed, determined to make numbers obey him. She had known for years that he belonged in those advanced classes more than many of the children whose parents fought to keep the doors shut. She continued down the hall toward the principal's office, needing to drop off a maintenance form. As she reached the door, she paused, hearing voices from inside. Two low male voices, speaking with clipped agitation. She recognized the principal's calm cadence, but the second voice was unmistakable. Barrett's tone carried a brittle frustration, the kind that came from losing control of a narrative he believed belonged to him. As she stood inches from the door, the vent above the frame sent the conversation directly toward her, every word sliding out with chilling clarity. Barrett insisted that allowing a janitor's child into an honors class undermined the academic structure he had spent decades shaping. He claimed it introduced unfair expectations, that it blurred the standards the school had proudly maintained. The principal responded carefully, mentioning paperwork and district approvals, but Barrett pushed back with pointed emphasis. He spoke of precedent, of traditions that could crumble if the school allowed exceptions based on feel-good policies. He said the words with a practiced elegance, but Denise heard the truth beneath them. It wasn't about academics. It was about maintaining the divide between legacy and labor. She stood without breathing until the voices lowered again. Her pulse thudded against her ribs, but she remained silent, absorbing every fragment of their strategy, every subtle attempt to remove her son from a place they believed he had stolen. The humiliation was sharp, but beneath it stirred something else, anger, not the loud kind that demanded confrontation, but the quieter, simmering kind that fed endurance. She backed away from the office, her footsteps slow and controlled, though her mind raced with 1,000 unnamed fears. Returning to her cleaning route, she found the custodial closet locked, which was odd. She always left it slightly ajar during her shift. Someone else must have used it recently. She fumbled for her keys, opened the door and stepped inside. The sharp scent of bleach hit her nose, but it wasn't the chemical smell that caught her attention. A trash bin near the corner was overflowing, something unusual for a room she had cleaned just an hour earlier. Paper scraps spilled over the rim, torn pieces curled around each other like tiny white ribbon. Something tugged at her instincts. She reached into the bin and lifted the shreds, feeling the faint imprint of official stationery. As she pieced together the fragments, she noticed a header from the counseling office, followed by handwriting she recognized instantly. It was Barrett's sharp strokes, heavy pressure, unmistakably his. The scraps appeared to be part of a form related to academic reassignment, though much of it was too shredded to interpret. Yet a single intact line preserved near the bottom landed like a blow to her chest. Concerns about academic integrity and classroom fit. Her hands froze. Something wasn't right. Counselors didn't usually write such notes without interviewing students, and Barrett had no authority to file reassignment paperwork without consent. The realization settled over her like a chilling gust. Someone was already working to remove her son from honors calculus. Before he even had the chance to prove himself, decisions were being made behind closed doors. As she sifted through another handful of paper, she found one scrap that hadn't been fully torn. It bore the start of a sentence in Barrett's handwriting, one she wished desperately she could unsee. It read, "Students of certain backgrounds tend to struggle with advanced mathematical abstractions." Her breath stalled. It wasn't evaluation. It was prejudice, and it was already being documented. But then she noticed something odd. Mixed among the shredded documents was a small, uncrumpled sticky note. Its neon surface stood out against the white scraps. She lifted it carefully. The note wasn't written by Barrett. The handwriting was looser, sharper, almost rushed. 3 words were written across it. 3 words not meant for her eyes. They read, "Check the folder." Her pulse spiked. There was no folder in sight, but someone clearly wanted her to find something. Someone who didn't want their identity revealed. She scanned the closet, her gaze snapping between shelves, cleaning supplies and old equipment boxes. Then behind a stack of unused floor mats, she spotted the edge of a blue file folder. She reached for it, heart pounding, knowing instinctively that whatever it contained could alter everything she believed about what her son was up against. Denise pulls the hidden folder toward her, and what she sees inside changes everything. By the time the first quiz results were handed back, the students in honors calculus were already whispering about what had happened during the 10-minute challenge the day before. The video, grainy but unmistakable, had circulated within school group chats, like a spark on dry grass. Zayden solving the impossible equation under pressure, the precision of his steps, the disbelief frozen on Mr. Barrett's face. Every frame was replayed, dissected, debated. Yet even as his classmates stared at him differently now, some with awe, others with quiet resentment, Zayden knew that none of it had changed the one thing that mattered most. Barrett didn't believe he belonged there. Or worse, he did believe it, and resented it. On the third day of class, Barrett returned the first quiz. His method of distribution said everything. The average scoring students got quiet nods, the high scorers got faint words of encouragement. When he reached Zayden's desk, Barrett didn't hand the paper down like the others. Instead, he called out his name, walked the aisle slowly, and dropped the quiz onto Zayden's desk with a practiced flick, like discarding something unworthy of his grip. His eyes didn't leave Zayden's face. The score in red ink, at the top of the paper, 100, 100, should have spoken for itself. But in Barrett's class, numbers weren't just numbers. They were permissions. Gateways. And for Zayden, that score was a trespass. Barrett's voice echoed through the room with deliberate calm, as he turned back toward the board. He said it was rare for a student to score perfectly on his first quiz, especially when that quiz covered foundational topics from previous years. Then he said casually but loud enough for everyone to hear, that the school had seen cheating rise dramatically in the last 2 years. Smartphones, AI tools, group chats. It was harder than ever to know who actually understood the material. Some students sat up straighter. Others exchanged looks, not quite sure if the accusation was real. Zayden didn't move. Barrett then added, without naming names, that certain students, particularly new ones, might feel pressure to perform, even if they didn't belong in such advanced classes. His eyes landed on Zayden as he said it. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a sentence. A few uncomfortable laughs echoed across the room. Then silence. Zayden's throat tightened. Not because he feared being accused, but because he'd seen this playbook before. Not in calculus classrooms, but in a dozen other arenas where the rules changed the moment someone like him played too well. He raised his hand. When Barrett nodded with an icy smile, Zayden stood and asked to retake the quiz in real time, under observation. The room shifted. That kind of offer wasn't normal. Some students turned in their chairs, now fully locked in. Barrett paused, then tilted his head and laughed. Not loud, just enough to belittle the request. He said it wasn't about theatrics. It was about integrity. If Zayden had cheated once, he said, he could cheat again. Retaking the test would prove nothing. But Zayden stood firm. He had no phone, no crib notes, just his mind. He repeated that he'd take any version of the quiz, right now in front of everyone. His voice didn't waver, and something about that stillness, about the way he didn't try to convince anyone, only offered to show cracked open something in the room. A voice from the middle of the room suddenly called out, "Let him prove it." Another joined, then a few more. Soon the class began to murmur together, students repeating the phrase louder, their voices overlapping. Let him prove it. Let him prove it. Barrett's face stiffened. He had lost control. His authority, so carefully curated, was suddenly being challenged by the very students who once treated his word like gospel. He raised a hand to settle the noise, then smiled tight-lipped. Professional. The kind of smile you wear when swallowing something bitter. He agreed, but with one condition. The quiz would not be the same. If Zayden wanted to prove himself, Barrett said, he'd need to do more than answer standard questions. He would write the new test himself. It would be a constructed response problem, open-ended, with multiple parts based on multi-step applications of derivative rules. The kind of problem that didn't have a quick answer. No multiple choice, no crutches. It would have to be solved, line by line in front of the class, and it would happen tomorrow. Zayden nodded once. The class, now fully alert, watched as the moment passed like a spark jumping from one nerve to another. For some it was just an academic drama, but for others, something deeper was shifting. An unspoken awareness that they had just witnessed the line where bias stopped being silent. After class, Barrett remained seated at his desk longer than usual. He watched the students file out. his expression unreadable. When the room emptied, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a file labeled Brooks Z. Inside were the quiz copy, the seating chart, and something else, a printed screenshot of an online calculus forum. At the bottom of the page was a thread dated 2 years ago. The question was nearly identical to one of the problems on the quiz. The answer posted matched Zayden's method perfectly. Barrett tapped the page with his finger. There it was. He would use this. That night, Zayden studied in silence at the kitchen table while Denise sat nearby folding laundry, her eyes occasionally glancing toward her son's face. She hadn't told him about the folder she found earlier in the custodial closet. Not yet. Something in her told her the time wasn't right. She just watched him work. The steady rhythm of his pencil. The calm way he flipped through the calculus book like it was a story he already knew by heart. He didn't ask her for help. He never did. But she stayed close anyway. At school the next morning, the energy in the classroom was unmistakable. Phones were tucked away, but students were alert, some whispering predictions, others clearly choosing sides. At the front of the room, the board was already clean. On Barrett's desk sat a single printed page, folded in half. He announced that today's session would be slightly different. A demonstration, an opportunity to address concerns. Zayden stepped to the board before being asked. Barrett walked to the front and slowly unfolded the page, then read aloud the problem. A function with variables nested inside an inverse, requiring a full derivative chain, including application of implicit differentiation, evaluated at 2 specific points. Multiple answers. No calculators. 10 minutes. He handed Zayden the marker and started the clock. The room went still. Zayden didn't pause. His hand moved quickly, faster than before. The board filled again with symbols, transitions, logical arcs that wrapped around the original function, like vines curling up a wall. He wasn't just solving, he was mapping a language, and the students felt it. But Barrett wasn't watching the math. He was watching the method, the steps, the pacing. He was looking for the flaw. 5 minutes passed, then 7. The problem was nearing its end. At minute 9, Zayden wrote his final line, boxed the answer, and stepped back. Applause broke out from the left side of the classroom. Someone whispered that it was perfect. Someone else whispered that Barrett looked pale, but Barrett didn't speak. He stepped to the board, red marker in hand, and circled one step line 4. He turned back to Zayden and asked him why he had chosen that substitution. Zayden calmly explained the shortcut, referencing an obscure rule from second-year college calculus. Barrett paused. That rule had not been taught yet. Not here. Not at any point in the AP curriculum. He asked how Zayden knew it. Zayden simply responded that he had learned it over the summer. Online lectures. Self-study. The room felt smaller. Barrett then turned back to the board and stared hard. But then he dropped his marker, walked to his desk, sat down, and without looking up, muttered that the test was over. The silence afterward was louder than the applause. But just as the bell rang, and students rose, one of the students at the back of the room opened their laptop, brows furrowed. They had searched the exact problem Barrett had given Zayden. The structure of the question, the values, the function, and what they found sent a chill down their spine. Barrett hadn't written the problem. He had taken it from an elite, paid-entry college competition site, one that required a login and cost hundreds of dollars to access. It wasn't part of the curriculum, and legally, students weren't allowed to be tested on content not offered in the syllabus. That student looked up, eyes wide, because if Zayden had failed, Barrett could have used it to have him removed from the class. Barrett agrees, but under one impossible condition. The room was silent, but not in a way that brought calm. This silence was electric, pulsing, heavy with the kind of suspense that makes seconds stretch. The quiz had been returned, and Zayden's name had already begun to circulate in whispers around the school. He had scored a perfect 100, every answer correct, every solution flawless. It wasn't just accurate, it was surgical, the kind of precision that didn't just suggest intelligence, but mastery, and that to Mr. Barrett was not acceptable. He hadn't even waited until the end of class to make his accusation. He'd held the paper between 2 fingers like it was something unclean, shaking his head as he scanned the neatly written steps again. Then, with careful cruelty, he had announced to the entire class that the quiz was compromised. He claimed the work couldn't possibly be original. Not from Zayden, not from someone like him. The class had shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, some exchanging nervous glances, others too stunned to move. No one spoke, not even Zayden. He had remained seated, his face a quiet storm, eyes unblinking, posture firm. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Barrett let it fester. When Zayden finally stood, he didn't plead, didn't offer a defense. He simply asked to take the quiz again, live in front of the class on the board, without notes or help. Barrett had smirked. The kind of smirk that carried centuries of dismissed genius and doors closed before they were ever knocked on. He agreed, but not without setting the rules. The board would be cleared, the problem would be chosen by him, and Zayden would have exactly 10 minutes, not a second more. Students shifted forward in their seats, notebooks forgotten. Phones began to record quietly under desks. Even those who had laughed earlier now watched with the wide-eyed thrill of witnessing something forbidden unfold. Barrett walked to the whiteboard with deliberate slowness, drawing out each marker stroke like a man signing a challenge into history. What he wrote wasn't just complex, it was cruel. A multivariable derivative problem designed to trap even gifted college students. Partial differentiation, implicit relations, nested functions, all tangled together like a net spun to catch a fraud. No junior in high school should have seen it before. As he stepped back, Barrett clicked the stopwatch in his hand. The room froze. Zayden approached the board without hesitation. There was no dramatic flourish in his steps, no smugness, just quiet determination. The kind carried by those who've had to prove themselves too many times in too many rooms where they were already decided against. He picked up the marker and began. His first movements were slow, not hesitant, but deliberate. He wrote as though he were tracing invisible steps already solved in his mind, like the board was just catching up to what he already knew. He didn't talk. He didn't pause to explain. He just worked, the marker gliding across the surface with rhythmic confidence. At first some students leaned back, assuming he'd freeze halfway through. But the board kept filling, and the structure of the work, the logic, the clean transitions, the exact labeling of each variable, it all pointed to something terrifying for Barrett. This wasn't luck. This was fluency. By minute 4, the problem was halfway solved. The audience had changed. Even those who had dismissed Zayden days earlier now leaned forward, phones in hand, whispering to one another about what they were witnessing. One girl in the front row whispered to her friend that she didn't even understand what he was writing, but she could tell it was right. Another student muttered that it looked like something out of a graduate textbook. Even the room's silence had changed. It was no longer quiet with doubt, it was breathless with awe. But Barrett wasn't ready to lose. He stood a few feet behind Zayden, arms crossed, stopwatch ticking, waiting, hoping for a mistake. A skipped step, a mislabel, anything. He whispered to himself that no one gets through that problem unscathed, that even his best students never finished it in time, that this boy, this janitor's son, was bluffing, had to be bluffing. But minute 7 came, then 8. Zayden's hand never slowed. He moved with terrifying clarity, as though he could see the endpoint before he even began. Barrett's fingers clenched around the stopwatch. For a moment, the teacher's face betrayed something rare, uncertainty. He glanced at the board again, and realized, to his horror, that the steps made sense. Zayden reached the final portion at minute 9. He circled his final answer with a swift stroke. 9 minutes and 57 seconds. He stepped back, lowered the marker to the tray, and walked calmly back to his seat, not looking at Barrett, not seeking praise. Just silent, steady defiance. The class was frozen. Barrett slowly approached the board. His eyes moved left to right, down each line, double-checking everything. The silence became oppressive. He scanned the variables, the limits, the transitions between each rule. He moved like a man reading a confession. He didn't want to believe. Then something strange happened. He smirked. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. A flicker of something smug crept across his face, and he turned back to the class. He told them it was impressive, but he'd seen a problem like this solved online, in a YouTube video that had gone viral years ago. He suggested maybe Zayden had memorized it. Maybe it wasn't real work. Maybe it was a parlor trick. Gasps moved across the room. Even now, after watching him do it in real time, Barrett was planting doubt. But before he could step away from the board, his eyes flicked once more to the lower corner. He leaned in, and suddenly, his face changed. His mouth parted slightly. His brows twitched. His shoulders tensed. Because there, in the bottom margin, Zayden had written a secondary solution, a shorter method. One not taught in AP Calculus at all. One that required abstract reasoning rarely found outside elite college programs. Barrett reached for the board, touched the final steps with his fingertip, as though needing to feel the ink to confirm it was real. It wasn't just right, it was better. His smirk disappeared, and for the first time in front of his students, Barrett looked deeply unsettled. Something in him had broken loose, a private certainty he had always carried, that students like Zayden couldn't be better than the system, was cracking under the weight of evidence he couldn't refute. He stepped back. One student in the front row whispered that she recognized part of Zayden's method from an MIT lecture. Another said they'd never seen a problem solved that cleanly. A boy with a Columbia sweatshirt muttered that his own older brother in college hadn't solved that problem as fast. Phones were still recording. Barrett looked up at the classroom, the lenses pointed at him, and realized this moment wasn't just lost. It was captured, archived, and about to be seen. His hand trembled slightly as he set the marker back into its tray. The bell rang. Students poured out into the hallway, buzzing with what they had seen. Some ran to tell others. Some already uploaded the footage online. But Zayden didn't rush. He stayed seated as the class emptied, gathering his things slowly, methodically. Barrett stayed too, but neither spoke. Because now the question was no longer whether Zayden could solve calculus. It was what Barrett would do now that he couldn't deny it. But just as Zayden was about to leave the classroom, Barrett called his name, not loudly, but firm. Zayden paused. Barrett didn't look angry. He didn't look defeated either. He looked like a man forming a strategy. Then, in the quietest voice Zayden had ever heard from him, Barrett offered a new test. A harder one. Not in class. Not with the students around. A private assessment. One that wouldn't be recorded. One that would really measure ability. Barrett set the terms. No warning. No leniency. No room for lucky guesses. Zayden paused at the door. He didn't respond, because he already knew what this was. Barrett hadn't surrendered. He had just raised the stakes. Barrett smirks, but then his face goes pale. By the time the footage of Zayden solving Barrett's impossible challenge had made its way into more than a few local group chats, the atmosphere at Clearbrook High had shifted, but not in a way that felt safe. Students talked, rumors multiplied, and admiration grew louder. But behind the scenes, something darker was forming. For every whisper of respect came a counter-whisper of resentment. A new target had been marked, and the systems that protected privilege were already stirring. That evening, just hours after Zayden's second live demonstration, an email landed in the inbox of every administrator on staff. The sender was masked, encrypted through a string of unfamiliar domains. The subject line read, "Urgent, academic integrity violation, Zayden Brook." Attached were several documents. A cropped image of Zayden's quiz, screenshots of supposed messages between him and an unidentified classmate, and a typed confession bearing his name. The screenshots painted a picture that had clearly been engineered. Alleged text discussing quiz answers in advance, a shared PDF with practice problems, and most damning, a forged email draft, where Zayden supposedly admitted to watching solutions online and memorizing the answers to impress his teacher. The confession was brief, blunt, and emotionless, nothing like Zayden's real voice. But that didn't stop it from triggering alarms. By the following morning, the school's internal system marked Zayden's academic record as under investigation. Access to his grades was restricted. His counselor received a notification to withhold all college application progress. In the faculty lounge, Barrett stood unusually quiet, offering no input when the principal briefed him on the situation. He simply nodded and sipped his black coffee. Zayden knew none of this. He arrived at school carrying the same worn backpack, unaware that his name had become a whispered warning. The few students who had been vocal in his defense now grew quiet when he passed. Some looked at him with cautious sympathy. Others, those who had always resented how he'd taken a top spot, whispered to each other, their eyes full of vindication. It wasn't until third period that Denise got the call. She was cleaning out a science lab storage room when her phone buzzed. The number flashed private, and she hesitated. When she answered, the principal's tone was cold, formal. He explained there had been a credible academic complaint against her son. He used words like digital evidence and plagiarism protocols. Denise's knees buckled slightly. He requested she come to the office for an in-person discussion. He did not use the word expulsion, but she felt it hanging there, unspoken but fully formed. By the time she arrived, the tension in the office was suffocating. Zayden sat in a small side room, flanked by two staff members who kept their voices measured, never accusatory, but never warm either. Denise was ushered into the principal's office, where a laptop was already open, displaying the alleged confession. She barely needed to read 3 lines to know it was fake. The grammar was stiff, The phrasing robotic, the tone unlike anything her son would write. But more than that, it reeked of desperation, of manipulation. She told the principal it was false, a setup, a malicious attempt to remove her son from the class. Her voice cracked as she explained everything. The quiz, the retest, Barrett's past remarks, the folder in the janitor's closet. She demanded they launch a real investigation, but he responded with rehearsed calm. The board would be meeting to review the matter. Until then, Zayden's enrollment in honors calculus would be suspended, and any college recommendation requests would be paused. He didn't say they believed the confession, but he didn't say they did. Denise left the office feeling like the walls had moved, like every door she'd fought to open for her son was now closing behind her with quiet, polished finality. Zayden didn't cry, not even when she told him. He just stared straight ahead, fists clenched in his pockets, jaw tight. He knew better than to plead for justice from people who had already written the ending. He had seen enough of the world to understand that proving yourself once wasn't enough. Not when people had already decided who you were supposed to be. But what he didn't know was that someone else had been watching. Someone inside the system. At 8:17 that night, Denise's phone rang again. Another private number. This time the voice on the other end was low, nervous but urgent. A woman. She didn't give her name. She said she was a teacher at the school, but couldn't identify herself yet. What she did say, however, stopped Denise cold. The voice claimed that the anonymous email wasn't anonymous at all, that the digital trail, while cleverly disguised, had been routed through a school login first, one tied to a faculty member's temporary laptop. The file properties of the fake confession revealed metadata that included a teacher ID. It had since been wiped from the system, but not before someone saw it, and that someone had screenshots. Denise's voice shook as she asked who it was. The woman paused, then told her she wasn't ready to say, but she knew Zayden was being set up, and she had the proof. Then came the last words before the line went dead. I know who's behind this. Zayden had always known the odds were steep, but he hadn't expected the battlefield to widen so quickly. In his mind, the struggle had been between him and one teacher, Barrett, whose bias was cold and obvious. But as the fallout from the anonymous email spread and whispers grew sharper, he realized he wasn't facing just a man. He was up against an institution, one that didn't wear its racism in slurs or threats, but in policy, silence, and well-dressed children with last names that echoed through plaques on the school's walls. At Clearbrook High, excellence had never truly been meritocratic. It was auctioned off quietly, behind closed doors lined with donor family photos and scholarship plaques. The top 3 students in the junior class were all white. Each had legacy ties, children of board members, CEOs and attorneys who hosted fundraisers for the district. Until Zayden entered honors calculus, their positions hadn't been questioned. Their SAT prep tutors were flown in from New York. Their applications were pre-polished by consultants. And most importantly, their comfort in every room made them untouchable. Zayden's presence had changed that. After his back-to-back test victories, and the failed attempt to frame him, he had begun to rise in the class rankings. Quietly, yes, but undeniably. Teachers other than Barrett started noticing his precision. His English teacher, Ramirez, left a note on his essay that called his thesis elite level. His physics lab partner, once skeptical, had started asking him for help. One by one, invisible walls began to shake. That's when the sabotage escalated. It started with small things. A question left blank on a test that Zayden swore he'd answered. A missing assignment that somehow never registered in the grading system. Then came something bolder. During a peer-graded project, one of the top-ranking students marked his work incomplete, claiming it had been submitted late, even though it had been turned in 2 days early. The teacher accepted the lower grade without question. Zayden knew what this was. It was coordinated, but he didn't have proof. Not until a whisper reached him, anonymous, but clear. Someone had found a group chat. It had started as a private DM thread between 2 students, both children of major donors, but had grown quickly. It was called Keep It Clean, a reference Zayden would later understand as code, keep the academic track clean, of outsiders, disruptors, anomalies. Inside that chat, screenshots showed conversations about how Zayden had stolen a seat, meant for one of them, how the school had bent over for optics, and how they needed to remind the board who really funds this place. They shared ideas, doctored images, talk of bribing a senior who worked in the registrar's office to quietly delete his GPA entry. One student bragged about having access to the back end of the parent portal, how easy it would be to flag Zayden's file for security review. There were even mock-ups of fake disciplinary slips, one of which listed a fabricated incident involving threatening a student during group work. Each message came with laughter emojis, cruelty masked in jokes. The leak came from someone inside the circle, an unnamed student who had been added by mistake and couldn't stomach what they saw. That student took screenshots. Dozens, but they were afraid to come forward. Their own standing, social and academic, depended on staying quiet. For days, Zayden walked the halls, surrounded by people who smiled too quickly or stared too long. He felt the walls watch him. Even students he'd once considered neutral now avoided his eyes, and still Barrett never addressed what had happened, never acknowledged the retests, never apologized. He just kept teaching, his voice colder than ever, his grading now wrapped in vagueness. Then Denise's worst fears were realized. On a quiet Thursday, she arrived at the school early for her shift. As she swiped her ID at the back entrance, a custodian who worked night security pulled her aside. He handed her a printed notice he'd found in the admin office trash bin, shredded but partially intact. It showed that Zayden's academic file had been flagged for review. His cumulative GPA had been lowered by 0.6 points. His math grade had been reclassified from A to incomplete. The file had been accessed 3 times in the past week from 3 different IP addresses, all originating from the administrative wing. She couldn't breathe. Someone was erasing her son's future from the inside out. Denise wanted to scream, to storm into the office, and demand justice, but she knew how they'd paint her. Angry, overreactive, emotional. So instead she took the printout, folded it carefully, and slid it into a protective sleeve in her bag. That night, she told Zayden everything. He didn't react the way she expected. No panic, no rage, just a deep stillness. He told her he would fix it, not by yelling, not by begging, but by outlasting them. He didn't want pity. He wanted proof. So he watched, he listened, he paid attention to every whisper, every error, every passing moment where the performance cracked. And then, one morning, he found something strange in his locker. A flash drive. No name. Just a small square sticker on the front. A white square with the words truth inside scribbled in black Sharpie. Zayden looked around. No one lingered. The hallway was busy, but no one paid him any special attention. Still, the feeling clawed at his spine. He tucked the drive into his bag and waited. That night, after Denise went to bed, he plugged it into the old laptop he used for homework. The folder that popped up had no title. Inside were dozens of files, PDF, screenshots, video clips, audio files. One video dated just 3 weeks earlier, opened with a recording from someone's phone camera. It showed Barrett in the staff lounge, talking with one of the school's curriculum directors. The audio was poor, but the words were undeniable. Barrett's voice was low, but the words were clear enough to destroy reputation. She's cleaning toilets while her son plays genius. It's laughable. The other voice responded, more cautiously. Careful, Colin. That's not the narrative the board's pushing. Barrett laughed, then added, they can push whatever they want, but if that kid finishes in the top 5, donors are going to start asking why their kids are behind a janitor's son. Zayden stared at the screen, his throat burning. Another file opened to a screenshot of an email string. Subject: recalibrating GPA metrics. One message came from an assistant registrar. Another, unmistakably, came from the school's vice principal. They were coordinating it, not just Barrett, but the system. That's when it hit him. This wasn't about a class anymore. It was about survival. He clicked the final file. It was a photo. A blurry shot of Barrett's classroom desk. On top sat a sealed manila envelope. Scrawled across the front. Brooks Z. Remove before transcripts update. Zayden's hand tightened around the mouse. The flash drive had come from someone close. Someone with access. Someone ready to burn the whole structure down. One student anonymously drops a flash drive into Zayden's locker. What's on it shocks him. Thank you for confirming. The flash drive had confirmed what Zayden already feared, but it also handed him something he didn't yet know he had. A story. Not just a moment of injustice, but a trail of evidence, a pattern, a system. That night, after hours of staring at the files in stunned silence, he copied them all to a secure folder and renamed it, something Denise would never guess, Calculus Proof Final Real, this time .zip. Then he did something he'd avoided up until now. He reached out to someone he didn't fully trust. That student who had once ridiculed him. Lena Brooks, no relation, daughter of a hedge fund manager, vice president of the school debate club, was the one who had recorded the first challenge video. At the time, she hadn't done it to help him. It was more for the novelty of it, the thrill of watching someone break under pressure. But now that it was clear Zayden hadn't cracked, and instead outperformed every other student including her, Lena's perspective had begun to shift. She hadn't said it out loud, but her actions were different now. When Zayden dropped that flash drive into her locker the next morning, with a single note, "If you think the truth matters, share this," she didn't hesitate. She uploaded the clip of Zayden solving the 10-minute challenge first. Within 6 hours, it hit 40,000 views on TikTok. By noon, it crossed. By the end of the day, it passed 1 million. The captions did all the work. "Janitor's son destroys racist teacher's math challenge live." The comments exploded. People from all over the country, teachers, parents, even university professors weighed in. They called it inspiring. They called it proof of buried genius. Some compared him to young Einstein. Others called him the real Goodwill Hunting. Then the hashtag started. "Let Zayden learn. Gifted not guilty. Black excellence under attack." The clip didn't need production value. It was raw, powerful, and undeniable. Zayden stood at the whiteboard like he belonged there, moving with calm intelligence while a teacher hovered behind him, visibly doubting every stroke of chalk, until the final answer silenced the entire room. It was the kind of moment you couldn't script. But fame is rarely merciful. By the end of the week, the clip had gone viral across multiple platforms. Reddit threads picked it up, breaking down the math step by step. Educators from across the country began reposting the clip in online classrooms. One professor from Princeton tweeted, "This student just did more for equity in STEM than most school districts have in decades. It should have been a win." But Clearbrook High didn't see it that way. Neither did the internet's darker corners. By day 3 of the clip trending, someone found Denise's Facebook. Then her LinkedIn, her phone number followed. Someone posted the address to their apartment building, in a comment under a local news station's repost of the video. The doxing started slowly. A few threats, a couple of mocking emails, but it escalated fast. Photos of her cleaning uniform were dug up. Someone posted a comment saying, "Funny how his mom scrubs toilets while he solves equations. Guess he learned to clean up messes early." Denise stayed off the internet. Zayden tried to, but the messages filtered through anyway on his phone and whispered conversations at school, in the way even his supporters talked about him like he was a symbol, not a person. And then came the news crews. 2 vans parked outside Clearbrook on a chilly Thursday morning. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward, cameras resting on tripods, anchors prepped with cue cards. Students were buzzing. A few teachers ducked out of view. But Barrett? He saw an opportunity. He stood in front of the main entrance wearing a pressed blazer and gave a brief, controlled interview. He said he welcomed attention but warned against narratives being weaponized. He blamed what he called performative outrage and woke hysteria for distorting what he described as a routine academic assessment. When asked if he had targeted Zayden unfairly, he simply said he had held all students to the same rigorous standard. That interview went viral too, but for the wrong reasons. One side of the internet erupted with rage. They replayed his quote side by side with the footage of Zayden calmly solving the problem he supposedly cheated on. They called for Barrett's removal. Some even called him the face of modern academic racism. Alumni from Clearbrook began issuing open letters. A petition was launched demanding an audit of his grading practices. It gained 50,000 signatures within 2 days. But another side of the internet painted Zayden as a fraud still. The same people who had once ignored the video now picked apart his posture, his confidence, even his silence. They said he had to be part of some liberal stunt, accused him of being a plant, of having the problem fed to him in advance. The school board went into full panic mode. Meetings were scheduled in private. Legal counsel was called in. The district issued a vague statement about ongoing internal review and respecting the privacy of all students. They didn't name Zayden, but the statement might as well have shouted his name. Then came the protest. On a Saturday morning, parents, students, and local community members gathered outside Clearbrook with signs. Some read, "Let Zayden learn." Others read, "Black brilliance is not cheating." A few students from a neighboring high school joined in, holding cardboard cutouts of calculators. Someone brought a speaker and played Nina Simone. Denise watched from the back of the crowd, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had never seen anything like it. Zayden didn't join them. He stayed home, pacing the living room, like a lion caged by his own dignity. He wasn't ready to be a symbol. He hadn't asked to be anyone's martyr. But the damage had already taken root. The school's website briefly went offline after being hit with traffic spikes and suspected cyber attacks. Faculty group chats imploded. And Barrett, still acting untouchable, was placed on temporary leave pending a broader review. And in the center of it all, Zayden stood alone. Then, on a quiet Monday morning, after the storm had begun to settle, a letter arrived in a sleek, cream-colored envelope with a crimson crest on its front. No return address. Zayden's name was handwritten in black ink. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of thick parchment. A formal letterhead at the top, Harvard University, Office of Pre-College Summer Programs. They had seen the video. They had reviewed his academic standing, and they were inviting him to apply for their elite summer program, an accelerated research initiative designed for gifted students who embody excellence despite structural barriers. They included a full scholarship,
No application fee,
no GPA requirement, just one request, a video submission explaining what education meant to him. Zayden sat frozen, letter in hand. Denise entered the room and stopped mid-step, her breath catching. They stared at each other, the weight of everything unsaid flooding between them. He was being seen. But for what? His ability? His story? His suffering? He didn't know. Zayden gets an invitation from Harvard. The letter from Harvard had arrived like sunlight after a long storm. But Zayden soon discovered that even sunlight could burn. He and Denise had held the envelope between them, both aware it was more than a letter. It was proof that he belonged. That the math hadn't lied. That all the quiet years of staying small in systems that weren't built for them had finally cracked open a window. But no one warned them how thin that window would be. 3 weeks later, Zayden stood under the towering gates of Harvard's campus for the first time. His suitcase felt heavier than it should have. The red brick buildings stretched high and proud against the late summer sky, and everything around him whispered legacy, wealth woven into architecture, tradition hidden in every creak of wood and polish of stone. Other students arrived in sleek sedans, their parents shaking hands with program directors like they were returning alumni. Zayden had taken a bus. From the moment he stepped into the welcome center, he could feel it, that quiet hum beneath polite smiles, the barely hidden stiffness in greetings, the way conversations paused when he entered a room. His name tag was handwritten, unlike the typed glossy ones others wore. The first staff member who greeted him, an orientation counselor with a clipped accent and practiced posture, had smiled without warmth, asking if he was in the right place. When Zayden told her he was there on scholarship, the words seemed to stall the air around them. Her smile didn't vanish, but it turned thinner. She reminded him of Barrett, only more polished. The first 2 days passed in a blur of lectures, campus tours and icebreakers, where students were asked about their parents' professions, favorite vacation spots, and dream tech internships. Zayden kept his answers short. When one girl joked about her dad funding half the science wing, the laughter that followed didn't reach him. He was invisible again, but not the safe kind of invisible. He was the kind that drew quiet eyes and louder questions. On the second night after returning from the dorm's study lounge, he found his roommate had locked him out. A whiteboard taped to the door read, "Studying, no interruption." Zayden didn't knock. He slept on a bench in the dorm's common area, using his hoodie as a pillow. No one asked why he was there. At the third morning orientation, during a break between lectures, a student walked past him and dropped a joke, just loud enough to hear. They wondered aloud whether his mom had been hired to clean the dorms too. The words weren't laced with violence. They didn't need to be. They were soaked in condescension, designed to remind him exactly where he stood. Zayden didn't flinch. He just turned on his phone's voice recorder and tucked it into his pocket. From that moment on, every interaction was documented, not because he planned to use it, but because he needed to know he wasn't imagining it. The microaggressions were everywhere. A counselor asked him twice to confirm he was a full participant in the STEM track. One lab instructor gently suggested he might want to audit the material first before engaging with higher-level projects. Another student asked how many community service hours he needed to get into the program, clearly implying he hadn't earned his place through academics. Zayden kept recording. Names, dates, phrases. His calm exterior remained untouched, but inside something was curling tighter each day. A coiled rope of exhaustion he couldn't cut loose from. Still, he excelled. Every seminar, every worksheet, every lab assignment, he finished ahead of schedule, sometimes improving the given method, instead of just solving the problem. One professor noted his work in quiet disbelief, but the praise was always private. Publicly, the tone remained neutral, distant, calculated. There was no celebration of excellence here, not when it came in skin they didn't expect it from. One evening, Zayden received an email. assigning him to a research group led by Dr. James Alden, a tenured professor in computational physics, whose name carried weight across the Ivy League. The assignment should have felt like an honor. Instead, it came with a sick feeling in his stomach. He had already heard things. How Alden wasn't fond of students who arrived through exceptions. How he once allegedly referred to an undocumented student as a diversity token with no calculus. But Zayden showed up anyway. The lab was located in a cold concrete annex building on the edge of campus, far from the ornate lecture halls. He arrived early, notebook in hand, eyes sharp. As he entered the lab space, he saw Alden already speaking with a small group of students near the board. Zayden paused just outside the room, hearing snippets of conversation that made his skin tighten. Alden was speaking with one of the program assistants. His voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. He was questioning why the summer roster had changed tone, asking why the program had shifted from recruiting top-tier prodigies to symbolic admissions. He laughed softly, saying some students were better suited to motivational brochures than machine learning labs. The assistant tried to push back, but Alden interrupted, wondering aloud how long until the school realized that charity can't teach math. Zayden stood frozen, fingers tightening around the edge of the doorframe. He reached slowly into his jacket and activated his phone's video recording. The camera lens captured Alden's face as he turned toward the assistant and delivered the line that would echo in Zayden's ears for months to come. They can come in with scholarships, sob stories, and cameras rolling. But at the end of the day, they don't have the wiring. You can't force pedigree. The words hit harder than anything Barrett had ever said. This wasn't petty bias. This was foundational. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the belief that no matter how much he accomplished, his presence here would always be viewed as contamination, an error to be corrected. He backed away from the doorway slowly, heart pounding, phone still recording. He didn't know what he would do with the footage. Not yet. But he knew what it meant. They didn't want him there. Not because he wasn't smart, but because he was undeniable. Because he made their systems look fragile. And if he stayed, if he succeeded, he wouldn't just prove them wrong. He would dismantle the myth they had built their futures on. He catches a professor saying something horrifying on camera, while Zayden moved through the halls of Harvard with a silent recorder in his pocket, gathering truths that could dismantle reputations. Denise found herself being hunted by truths of her own. The ones she had buried so deep she thought they'd disintegrated with time. But secrets never vanish, they settle, and when the right storm comes, they rise. It began with a knock at her apartment door. 3 sharp raps followed by silence. Denise opened it cautiously, expecting a neighbor, maybe another reporter. Instead, a young woman in oversized glasses introduced herself as a freelance journalist writing a feature on hidden education legacies. Her tone was sweet, her smile disarming, but her questions were surgical. She already knew too much. She wasn't there to ask if Denise had gone to college. She was confirming whether she had in fact attended MIT. Denise froze. The last time she had said the word MIT out loud was nearly 2 decades ago. It no longer felt like a chapter of her life, but someone else's story, a version of herself that didn't survive. She told the journalist nothing, just that she had a shift to finish. The woman thanked her politely and slipped her a card before leaving. But the damage had been done. That evening, Denise couldn't sleep. She sat at the edge of the bed, watching the news in silence, as a local segment aired about Zayden's viral success. But this time, the headline had changed. Dropout janitor raises calculus prodigy. The photo on screen was one she didn't recognize. Her old college ID, grainy and scanned. Below it, a glowing write-up. Denise Brooks, once a top student at MIT, disappeared from the academic world after her junior year. Now, her son is reshaping the narrative. But that wasn't the story. It was the headline they liked. The single mother, the dropout, the redemption arc they could exploit without asking why she left, what it cost her, or whether she ever got to finish what she started. Zayden saw the segment too. He didn't say anything, just asked gently why she never told him. Denise brushed it off with a quiet explanation that it was a different life, and she hadn't wanted to burden him with her failures. He nodded, respectfully, but something in his eyes had changed. He wanted to know more, and she wasn't ready to give it. 2 days later, her phone rang, an old number she hadn't seen in years. She let it go to voicemail, but the message left behind made her hands tremble. It was Dr. Harlan, a name she hadn't spoken in nearly 20 years. He had been her faculty advisor at MIT. He was the one who had pushed her into theoretical physics, The one who once said she was the sharpest undergrad he'd seen in a decade. She had trusted him. Until she couldn't. His voice on the message was older, raspier, but unmistakably his. He warned her. A records request had been filed under her name. Someone was digging deeper than just newsworthy fluff. He said he didn't know who, but the pattern was clear. Her files, her withdrawal letter, even her sealed disciplinary file. Someone was unsealing it. Denise sat motionless on the couch for nearly an hour. That file was supposed to be buried. She had signed the non-disclosure agreement, under pressure, told that if she walked away quietly, she could keep her scholarships from being publicly revoked. No charges, no headlines, just silence. And she had accepted. For Zayden. Back then she had already been pregnant. She hadn't told anyone, not even Harlan. She knew what it would look like. Another brilliant girl from a poor neighborhood who couldn't handle the pressure. But the real reason she left was far worse. In her junior year, she had co-authored a paper on quantum elasticity with a tenured professor, Dr. Carr, a man with powerful friends. Her contributions had rewritten the way the team understood atomic stress lines. But when the paper was published, her name was gone. When she confronted Carr, he had offered her a deal: take the summer fellowship in silence or lose everything. He told her she had two choices: compliance or exile. She chose exile. What followed was a carefully orchestrated breakdown. Accusations of unprofessionalism, rumors about conduct, a hearing stacked with bias. By the end, she signed the withdrawal papers with trembling hands, walked out of MIT, and never looked back. She had buried the shame so deep, it fused into silence. Not even Zayden knew what she had given up.
Now someone was about to resurrect it.
The next morning, an envelope was slid under her apartment door. No return address, just her name written in black ink. She opened it slowly, hands stiff. Inside was a thick stack of documents, photos, a printed copy of the original paper, this time with her original contributions highlighted in yellow. A typed confession from an anonymous graduate student who had been part of the lab at the time, confirming her role had been scrubbed. And finally, a letter. No signature, just one chilling sentence at the top. Zayden must never see this. Denise stared at the words, heart pounding, her fingers trembling, because she recognized the font. It was the same default font used on her MIT dismissal letter, one she had burned years ago, but never forgotten. Someone inside the system hadn't just found her past. They were repackaging it, weaponizing it, and they had made it clear. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about her son. Denise receives an envelope, labeled Zayden, must never see this. Zayden's name had begun to stretch far beyond the limits of Clearbrook High. He was no longer just the boy who outshone his calculus teacher. He had become a symbol, a prodigy molded in silence, rising despite suffocation. News outlets referred to him as America's unlikely math mind, and educators debated whether traditional schools could contain minds like his. But while the world was beginning to see Zayden as exceptional, Miss Barrett saw him as a threat that had slipped through his fingers, and that threat had to be contained. The day Barrett returned from administrative leave, the school felt colder. His walk was slower, his words more measured. The scandal had shaken his public image, but not his confidence. If anything, the temporary silence had given him time to plan, to reassert control, and to find new ways to finish what he had started. He knew Zayden was applying to colleges, elite ones. He also knew the recommendation process relied heavily on the credibility of the recommending teacher, and no one at Clearbrook had taught Zayden long enough, or closely enough to challenge his authority. Barrett had already written Zayden's letters before the scandal broke, and what he had once written begrudgingly, acknowledging Zayden's intellect in a single paragraph, was now sitting in a locked cabinet. Barrett didn't revise the letters, he replaced them entirely. In his rewritten versions, the tone shifted from reluctant praise to subtle sabotage. He described Zayden as technically capable, but ethically questionable. He referenced ongoing internal reviews, without providing details. He inserted careful language about concerns raised by faculty and staff. No outright lies, just enough ambiguity to plant unease. Then, with the original letters in hand, Barrett walked to the staff lounge's fireplace, a remnant of the school's historic architecture, rarely used except during alumni tours. He lit a match, fed the letters into the flames one by one, and watched them curl into smoke. To anyone passing by, it looked like a teacher disposing of old drafts. But to Barrett it was the final act in a performance he had perfected over years, shaping futures with a pen, or destroying them with a few carefully chosen words. Within 2 weeks, Zayden's inbox, once filled with polite interest and early encouragement, began to shift. The first email was from a mid-tier liberal arts college, regret to inform, then another from a university that had previously fast-tracked his application, now unable to proceed. By the third rejection, Denise noticed the change in his posture. He stopped checking his email at the table. He stayed up later staring at blank documents, not writing anything. She asked if something was wrong. Zayden said no, but the truth was closing in. One morning he received a notification from a scholarship foundation he had been shortlisted for. The message was short, thanking him for his time, but stating they could no longer consider applicants under active ethical review by their academic institution. Zayden read the sentence over and over, the words blurring together. He hadn't cheated. He hadn't lied, but his file was contaminated. Barrett hadn't needed proof, only access. The final blow came when the state university, once considered a safety school, sent a rejection letter, citing inconsistent recommendations. They didn't mention specifics. They didn't have to. Zayden knew the language. By then his school record had been restored, his GPA corrected, and the fake confession exposed. But those victories were buried beneath algorithms and email threads that had already flagged his name. His past had been rewritten by someone with power, and now the future he had built was unraveling. He went to the counseling office to request his full college application packet, hoping to find an error he could appeal. The secretary, a woman who once praised his test scores with genuine warmth, now looked at him differently. She hesitated before handing over the folder. Inside, the printed recommendation letters made his stomach turn. Barrett's signature sat neatly at the bottom of each one. Each letter was short, and each one was laced with sabotage disguised as professionalism. Zayden read them in silence. Not one mentioned his viral accomplishments. Not one referenced the challenge problems he solved, or the mathematical breakthroughs he had quietly made in school labs. Instead, the letters framed him as a liability. Smart, yes, but difficult to manage, overly sensitive to critique, and increasingly confrontational with staff. They made him sound like a ticking bomb. He closed the folder slowly. That night, Denise found him sitting at the kitchen table, with his head down, the letter stack fanned out beside him. She reached for the papers, but he slid them away. He told her he was tired. Tired of proving his worth only to have it erased. Tired of being excellent on paper and invisible in process. Tired of smiling while people rewrote his story from behind closed doors. Denise didn't cry. She had used up her tears years ago. Instead, she stood beside him, one hand on his shoulder, and told him they weren't done. But even she didn't know what to do next. Then late that night, Zayden's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, then picked up. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but urgent. The caller identified herself as an admissions officer from a top-ranked East Coast university. She told him she wasn't supposed to be calling, not directly, not without permission, but something about his file had stayed with her. She said she had read his essays twice, watched his viral videos, and then compared them to the letters submitted by his school. She said the math didn't add up. Zayden didn't speak. He didn't trust the silence yet. Then she said the one thing he hadn't expected to hear. She believed him, and she had proof that someone had tampered with more than just his letters. One admissions officer breaks protocol and calls Zayden directly. By the time Denise filed the civil suit against the Clearbrook School District, the story had outgrown Clearbrook itself. It was no longer a local issue, no longer about a gifted black student and a resentful teacher. It had become a national case, a legal crucible for everything simmering beneath America's most prestigious public schools. Systemic bias, generational privilege, and how racism had learned to wear a tie. The courtroom on the first day of the hearing was standing room only. Local reporters lined the back wall. Parents whispered from the benches. Students who had once whispered about Zayden in hallways now sat stiffly beside their families, unsure of which version of the truth to believe. Even rival school districts had quietly sent representatives. Everyone wanted to see if this boy, this math prodigy, could prove what so many felt but couldn't quantify, that the system was rigged. The suit alleged racial discrimination, academic sabotage, and suppression of college opportunities by school officials, specifically Mr. Barrett and unnamed members of the registrar's office. Denise, seated beside her attorney, remained composed. She had worn her quiet pride like armor for years, but this courtroom felt different. Here, her silence could finally speak. Barrett arrived looking untouched. Hair trimmed, suit pressed, his expression polished with the smugness of a man who still believed the rules didn't apply to him. He walked past Zayden without even a glance. The judge was firm, fair, but visibly intrigued. He reminded the court this wasn't a criminal trial. It was civil, focused on damages, policy failure, and pattern behavior. But even as he said it, the room could feel the weight pressing down. This wasn't just about one student, it was about hundreds. Barrett took the stand first. His testimony was cold, calculated. He denied bias, claimed his grading was consistent. He insisted that Zayden had not been targeted, only held to appropriate expectations. When asked about the burned recommendation letters, he claimed administrative miscommunication. He never raised his voice. He never flinched. But then came the evidence. Denise's attorney presented a slideshow of altered grades, falsified timestamps, and metadata showing Barrett's unique login accessing Zayden's GPA file at odd hours. Then came the flash drive files, screenshots of Barrett's internal emails, where he described Zayden as a media pawn and warned of overcorrecting public opinion. Still, Barrett held his composure. He called them out-of-context frustrations. He claimed the grading system was complex, and errors happened. Then it was Zayden's turn. He stepped up in a black dress shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, with no notes in hand, just a laptop, and a quiet confidence that made the room lean forward before he even spoke. The judge asked him to explain what he had prepared. Zayden nodded once, and began. He didn't defend his character. He didn't recount the insults. Instead, he opened a spreadsheet and turned the courtroom into a classroom. Using publicly available grade records from Clearbrook's own district data, along with honor roll placements, teacher logs, and class-level recommendations over the past 5 years, Zayden had built a mathematical model tracking student performance by race, gender, and teacher assignment. He coded the data into visual graphs, laying out a pattern so undeniable it silenced the entire courtroom. He showed how students of color were consistently under-recommended for AP classes, even with equal or higher test scores. He presented a side-by-side chart of Barrett's grading history, where black students scored on average 12.3% lower than white students with the same cumulative GPA. Then he zoomed in on his own record. He demonstrated how a 1-point GPA change, done without authorization, pushed him out of the top 5 ranking during the application cycle, disqualifying him from several automatic scholarships. Zayden wasn't emotional. He was surgical. He turned systemic harm into numbers, bias into percentages, suppression into data points. Each slide landed like a blow, not just to Barrett, but to the entire district. The courtroom was so quiet, every key tap echoed off the walls. When he was done, Zayden turned to the judge and said he had just one question. If he could see this, why hadn't anyone else? For a moment, even the judge sat still. The silence that followed wasn't the end. Because then came the twist. Zayden's attorney, almost as an afterthought, submitted one last exhibit, a letter, found in the superintendent's inbox 3 months prior, from an anonymous teacher. It referenced internal pressure to dissuade Zayden Brooks from certain academic tracks. Attached was a note from the district's legal team, warning against commenting on the case before reviewing potential financial fallout. The judge's expression shifted. The pieces were no longer speculative. They were systemic. As Zayden stepped down, eyes across the courtroom followed him, not with pity, but with awe. The boy they had once called a cheater had just exposed an entire system with a whiteboard's worth of numbers. But just as the proceedings neared recess, the judge adjusted his glasses and turned back to Zayden. He had one final question, one not listed in any file, any prep document or testimony. He asked Zayden calmly, seriously, if he still wanted to attend college within this system. The room tilted. Zayden blinked once, because no one expected the question, and no one was prepared for the answer. The judge asked Zayden one unexpected question. The judge's unexpected question still echoed in Zayden's mind, long after the courtroom recessed. The world saw the inquiry as philosophical, almost rhetorical, but Zayden had recognized something deeper beneath it. It hadn't been about doubt. It had been a warning, a nudge toward the truth that the path he was fighting to walk had been tampered with long before he ever reached it. Yet while he processed the meaning of that moment, another storm gathered. One aimed not at him, but at the man who had quietly carried the weight of the district's secrets for years. Principal Howard Mercer. Mercer had always been the kind of administrator who walked school hallways with a tired smile. Someone who looked like he had made peace with a job that never stopped demanding more than it returned. His office walls were lined with plaques he never bragged about, and awards he never mentioned. While parents saw him as neutral, neither enemy nor ally, There were whispers Diggum faculty, whispers that he knew far more about Barrett's behavior than he ever admitted. Pressure had been mounting on him since the trial began. Reporters crowded his doorstep. District officials bombarded him with calls. A quiet investigation began swirling around his actions, or inaction, and yet he had remained silent, letting Barrett's name absorb the public wrath. But silence, like guilt, has an expiration date. The breaking point came late on a rain-soaked Thursday afternoon. Denise had returned to the school to pick up some final documents needed for the lawsuit. Mercer's assistant greeted her with a nervous expression, as if she had been rehearsing something she wasn't ready to say. Moments later, Mercer called Denise into his office. When she entered, she found him sitting not behind his desk but beside it, shoulders slumped, hands clasped tightly. His usually polished voice sounded frayed. He told her to close the door, and when she did, he lowered his head and admitted that he had watched the courtroom footage over and over. Not the accusations, not Barrett's testimony, but the way Zayden presented the data, how he broke down 5 years of patterns into undeniable evidence. Mercer said it had forced him to see something he had spent years avoiding. He was part of the system that allowed this to happen. He told her he had once tried to challenge Barrett quietly. Years ago, when other parents had complained about grade manipulation, when he'd seen black and brown students denied accelerated classes, despite qualifying scores. But each time, the district board reminded him who funded their programs, who paid for the new science labs, whose names hung on the gymnasium's wall. His efforts were met with gentle reprimands, subtle reminders that he was replaceable, but donors were not, and so he had backed down. Denise didn't interrupt. She didn't soothe him. She simply watched a man unravel under the truth of his own cowardice. Mercer reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out a small brass key. It was old, scratched along the edges, the kind that belonged to furniture no one touched anymore. He placed it in Denise's palm and told her it opened a drawer he had kept locked for 8 years. He admitted he had collected documents, things he had been afraid to report, afraid to expose, afraid to challenge. But now, after seeing Zayden dismantle an entire system in one courtroom presentation, he realized fear no longer justified silence. He led her to a side storage room, attached to his office, a room few knew existed. He unlocked the door, gesturing her inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and old ink. A metal filing cabinet sat against the wall, its paint peeling. Mercer pointed to the bottom drawer. Denise inserted the key. The lock clicked open with a reluctant groan. Inside, neatly stacked folders filled the drawer from front to back. Mercer explained that each one held a piece of evidence he had been too afraid to file officially. Some were copies of grading audits. Others were email exchanges with Barrett and board members warning of reputation risks if certain students, mostly students of color, were placed into advanced tracks. There were spreadsheets showing manipulated class ranks, handwritten notes from influential parents begging for their children's positions to be protected, and correspondence from a donor whose son had failed pre-calculus twice but was still placed in AP calculus to maintain legacy continuity. Then, the worst of it. Envelope after envelope labeled confidential recommendation adjustments. Inside were copies of altered letters, some rewritten to praise students who had mediocre performance, but wealthy parents. Others rewritten to subtly undermine students who had outperformed expectations, but lacked the appropriate background. Barrett's patterns were unmistakable. Mercer admitted he had confronted him once, but Barrett had waved it off, claiming discretion was part of maintaining academic integrity. The board had sided with Barrett. As Denise sifted through the papers, something inside her tightened. This was not just negligence. This was structural sabotage. A machine built to preserve privilege and bury talent like her son's. One folder in particular made Mercer's voice crack. It contained donor envelopes, checks stapled to letters thanking Barrett for his support or promising continued partnership. They weren't illegal, not directly, but the pattern was unmistakable. Students whose parents donated heavily received inflated grades, placement estimates, and glowing recommendations. For years, Denise felt the weight of 2 decades bearing down on her. MIT, the sealed file, her silence, and now this. She wondered how many children had been robbed of their futures. How many Zaydens sat in classrooms believing they weren't enough when the truth was that the deck had been stacked against them from the beginning. Mercer sat at a small table, head in his hands. He said he wanted to come forward before the lawsuit, but he feared losing his position, his pension, everything he had built. But after seeing Zayden speak, after watching a boy much younger than himself stand in front of a judge and challenge an institution. He realized that integrity meant nothing if it only appeared when convenient. Denise gathered all the documents into a single archive box. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what this evidence meant. The lawsuit would explode. This wasn't just racial bias. This was institutional corruption. When she left Mercer's office, the hallway felt different, like truth itself had shifted the ground beneath the school's polished floors. She walked out of the building with the box pressed against her chest, unaware that someone had been watching from the upper window. Someone who quickly dialed a number as soon as she exited the building. Within hours, the documents were scanned, digitized, and submitted as supplemental evidence to the ongoing lawsuit. National media got hold of the story. Headlines erupted across platforms. School manipulated grades for donors' children. Evidence suggests widespread racial bias in honors placement. Principal breaks silence, reveals years of academic tampering. And in the background of every article was Zayden. Not as a symbol this time, as the catalyst. But just as the momentum seemed to shift fully in their favor, just when Denise believed they had finally uncovered the last of the buried secrets, 3 unmarked black SUVs pulled into the Clearbrook High parking lot at dawn. Doors opened. Agents stepped out. Badges flashed. The school security cameras still recording captured the moment federal authority entered the building. The FBI shows up at the school. The arrival of federal agents at Clearbrook High cast a long, cold shadow over the institution's polished facade. Within hours, news vans formed a tight ring around the campus, their cameras trained on the main entrance. The administration building doors opened under the weight of indictment. Among the gathered students, teachers, and nervous parents, one name rose above the chaos. Barrett, the teacher who had once sneered at a janitor's son, now faced charges beyond simple bias: tampering with academic records, falsification of recommendation letters, and conspiring with board officials to manipulate class rankings in exchange for donor favor. In that moment, Barrett's power crumbled. The arrest was painlessly swift. Agents led him out in handcuffs, his tie askew, his face an ashen mask of disbelief and rage. Rage not at being exposed, but at being exposed by someone he considered beneath him. The students gathered in the courtyard, watched in silence as he was escorted into the SUV, the metal door slamming shut like the final seal on a corrupted legacy. Some of the richer kids looked away, others whispered among themselves, but none dared step forward. No one laughed. The silence spoke louder than any cheer. In the aftermath, the school board convened emergency meetings. Under pressure from parents, media, and the weight of the documented scandal, the board was dissolved. Trustees resigned, funding oversight committees were disbanded, and the entire administrative hierarchy was replaced under a state-appointed review panel. Clearbrook High, which for decades had hidden inequities under clean floors and scholarship plaques, was forced to confront its history. The walls that once echoed privilege now trembled under the burden of truth. For Zayden, the shift was surreal. Just days earlier, he had sat in court, watched as his own worth was questioned by voices dripping with entitlement. Now the same halls echoed with his name. Not with laughter, but with respect. Students who had avoided him now walked beside him. Teachers who once scrolled past his file with indifference now kept their eyes averted. The moniker given by local reporters, the calculus kid, found its way into whispered reverence on campus. It wasn't just a nickname. It was recognition. Offers came washing over him like a rising tide. 5 Ivy League institutions sent full scholarships, tuition, housing, books, research opportunities, all funded. Letters of intent arrived, addressed to him, congratulatory and genuine. Admissions officers expressed admiration, not only for his scores but for his courage, his character, his resilience. For once, doors opened, not because of lineage or wealth, but because of undeniable talent and integrity. Denise watched him as though she were seeing someone else. The boy who once carried a battered backpack through the dust of janitor's work now stood at a new crossroads, one shaped by promise. Her chest rose and fell with guarded hope. She could feel the weight of years of shame and silence lifting, replaced by something precarious but real. She dared to imagine a future she had never allowed herself to see. But pride is often the most dangerous emotion in a room built on fragile illusions. As the school reorganized, as federal investigators sifted through decades of archived data, something unexpected appeared. A document surfaced, a petition signed by several parents and alumni, circulated quietly before Barrett's arrest. It called on the state to decertify Clearbrook's honors and AP program, citing systemic mismanagement and lack of oversight. The petition argued that nothing short of a complete reset would restore credibility. In other words, they didn't want reform, they wanted erasure, with the honors program slated to be reevaluated. Many of the teachers, good ones, fair ones, began pulling their support. They feared association with scandal, despised headlines, or simply wanted out. And under pressure, the state-appointed panel announced that next year, honors calculus would be suspended. On top of that, grant applications for advanced STEM labs were frozen pending audit. In effect, every pipeline that could lead bright but underprivileged students to opportunities was threatened. The system's reset meant shutting down the very doors Zayden had forced them to open. Zayden stood at the edge of this collapse, offered all the scholarship letters in the world. He could pack up, leave, start fresh. But his heart pulled him another way. He gathered a small group, students, teachers, parents who felt the weight of guilt or responsibility, those who believed opportunity shouldn't be a privilege. Together they drafted an open letter, a proposal for a new equity program for public schools nationwide. It called for transparent grading audits, independent oversight boards, and funding based on need, not donations. It asked for scholarship pools dedicated to talented students from overlooked communities. It demanded accountability for educators and administrators who abused their power. He sent the draft to the State Education Committee. He shared it with journalists. He posted it online, not as protest but as a blueprint. He used his newfound visibility not to escape the system, but to challenge it from within. The response was immediate. Thousands signed. Some local politicians praised it. Others criticized it, calling it unrealistic or anti-privilege. But for the first time, the conversation shifted. Not about one boy, but about the structure that tried to bury him. Then, one crisp autumn morning, as sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the school's auditorium, Zayden stood at a makeshift podium. The chairs weren't fully filled, but the energy was heavy, charged. Students, parents, community leaders gathered. He didn't speak of triumph or revenge. He spoke of equity, of potential, of doors that needed to stay open for others who looked like him, and for those who would never get the chance to raise their voice. He didn't ask for applause. He asked for change. As he stepped down, a single email notification popped up on his phone, unnoticed by most. He opened it. It was from a congressional aide, short, formal, but urgent. It said a seat had opened up on a national education review panel, and they believed his voice belonged there. His breath caught. Denise, standing in the back, saw the shift in him, a flicker of shock, then resolve. He looked out at the crowd. He looked at the broken system behind them, and he realized this wasn't over. He's invited to speak before Congress. The morning of the congressional hearing dawned under a cold, steely sky, as though the heavens themselves sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. Outside the grand marble building where the hearing would take place, cameras and reporters clustered in knots, their lenses pointed like hungry eyes waiting for blood. On the sidewalk steps, protesters, former students, parents, community activists, held signs demanding accountability. Among them stood Denise Brooks, clutching a simple cardboard placard that read only, "Let justice count." Behind her, a handful of students from Clearbrook High stood with cautious pride. For weeks, their halls had shaken under scandal. Now that tremor had rippled outward into the very heart of power. Inside the hearing chamber, the air smelled faintly of polished wood, old law books, and the soft electric hum of anticipation. Rows of seats bore the weighty names of senators, committee members, education lobbyists, and legal counsel. At the back, family members and supporters sat in silence, cameras off but eyes alert. Zayden Brooks entered last, dressed in a dark suit a few sizes too large, his shoulders squared, his eyes steady. He paused in the doorway, letting the room settle around him. The heavy curtains, the polished brass nameplates, the murmurs fading to hushed hush. He carried nothing but a slim folder and a quiet resolve, the result of years of being told he didn't belong. When the committee chair called him forward, the room fell still. The murmurs died, the flashes stopped, and all attention zeroed in on him. He didn't begin with anger or accusation. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath, opened his folder to a sheaf of data, spreadsheet after spreadsheet, graphs, annotated transcripts, public school records, archived grading sheets, demographic comparisons. Then almost gently, he began to speak. He spoke not as a victim, but as a builder. With calm clarity, he laid out the structure of what he called systemic educational injustice, a statistical and human cost. He walked the committee through the last 10 years of data collected not just from his own school, but from dozens of districts with similarly skewed demographics. He highlighted a pattern: identical test scores, identical coursework, identical homework completion, yet profoundly different outcomes. Honors placements handed to wealthy legacy students, advanced courses denied to scholarship kids, despite equal or better performance. Discouraging comments masked as concerns of fit or integrity. Each example came with numbers, percentages, and real names, anonymized but traceable. But Zayden did not stop at deconstruction. He offered a blueprint. He proposed a federal mandate for transparent grading audits in public schools, with annual reports made public. He called for independent review boards, not school administrators, but community-appointed panels, with representation from parents, former students, and civil rights advocates, to oversee placements, class allocations, and scholarship distributions. He outlined a national scholarship fund for underprivileged but high-performing students, sponsored by public-private partnerships, removing donor bias entirely from outcome. He argued for recalibrated funding formulas so that schools in low-income neighborhoods would not rely on wealthy donors to afford labs, tutors, or advanced classes. For every point of data, he had a human face: a janitor's child who solved multivariable derivatives under pressure, a single mother whose degrees were scrubbed from records, students who were buried by silence. As he closed his presentation, he didn't call for punishment. He called for trust. He asked Congress for the chance to rebuild, not to tear down every school, but to fix the foundation: fairness, transparency, dignity. The chamber remained quiet for long seconds, as though absorbing a weight it had never acknowledged. Then eyes began to glisten, some with tears, others with disbelief. A murmured assent here, a quiet sniffle there. Journalists scribbled furiously. Aides exchanged stunned glances. It felt less like a speech and more like a reckoning. Then came the unexpected twist. From the side benches, a senator, known historically for staunch support of the donor-funded status quo, sat forward. His earlier posture had been rigid. Now his shoulders slumped, jaw slack. He rose slowly, voice measured but soft, and asked if, given those facts, he could deny that the system was broken. The words hung in the air, echoing not just in the chamber but outside, where cameras and ears waited. No rebuttal followed, no pre-written statement. For the first time, one of the system's fiercest defenders publicly acknowledged the possibility of change. Across the room, others shifted uneasily. Lobbyists exchanged nervous glances. The tension was sharp, but what had begun as a hostile hearing was fracturing, the foundation cracking. Reporters later wrote that the moment felt like a tectonic shift beneath decades of unspoken agreement. For the first time, the institution faced not just accusations, but its own silence. When Zayden stepped down from the podium, the chamber rose, not in applause. That would be too radical. Instead, there was quiet respect, heads bowed, notebooks closed, phones shut. Outside, the protesters erupted in cheers, cameras flashed, social media exploded. Justice and calculus trended within hours. Former close-minded commentators changed tone. Editorials sprouted overnight. The story was no longer about one boy. It was about a system cracked open. But while the world watched, some of the smallest moments carried the most weight. In the gallery, Denise sat clutching the edge of the wooden bench, tears running freely down her cheeks, not from relief, but from knowing that for the first time, her own silence might not be required anymore. A teacher who once ignored her mop bucket now watched his institution tremble under truth. Students from other schools reached out to her, sending messages: "Thank you for believing in him. We see ourselves in him." She felt the pain of 20 years, MIT erased, semesters lost, flicker, and fade into something like hope. Backstage, as cameras packed up and buzz faded, Zayden collected his notes. His folder, once heavy with data and evidence, felt somehow lighter, like a burden turned into purpose. Reporters tried to corner him, to get a quote, but he refused. He didn't want sound bites. He wanted change. That evening, as he walked down the cold stone steps of the Capitol building, with Denise beside him, he paused. The porch lights glowed, the wind whispered, and for a moment, the world seemed silent again. Then, the unexpected. A Congress aide approached him quietly, handing him an envelope. Inside was a formal invitation, a seat on a newly formed National Education Reform Panel. Not just to observe, but to help write the legislation, to sit at the table where decisions would be made. Zayden looked at the letter. then at Denise. In his eyes there was something new. Not just triumph, but responsibility. The kind that stretches beyond self, beyond one story, into an entire future. He knew this was not just about winning. It was about building, reforming, ensuring that no child, no matter their zip code, their parents' job, or the color of their skin, would ever walk into a classroom and hear life defined for them before they'd solved a single equation. As they stepped into the night, the Capitol domes rising behind them, Zayden felt a shift beneath his feet, the kind that said, "The fight is far from over." A senator privately approaches Zayden and asks whether he would consider running for office. The years that followed rolled forward with the slow inevitability of tides reshaping the shore. The firestorms around the scandal cooled to embers, then to memory. But for Zayden Brooks, the battle had opened a door, not just to his personal vindication, but to a purpose larger than any one classroom, any one test, any one school. What had begun as a fight to clear his name, to prove a single truth, transformed into a mission to rewrite the rules themselves. He founded the organization quietly at first, a nonprofit dedicated to identifying mathematically gifted students from underrepresented, low-income backgrounds. He named it the Brooks Equity in STEM Foundation. The first summer, he and his mother worked out of a borrowed office space above a shuttered community center, their startup funded by a scattering of small grants and a few generous donations from educators who believed in fairness. Denise, who once scrubbed floors before sunrise, now sat at a desk reviewing budgets, grants, scholarships, outreach expenses. Her hands, once hardened by mop handles and bleach bottles, were now steady, skilled in balance sheets and financial allocations. She had become the foundation's CEO. Those early years were precarious. There were months when funds ran low, when schools declined to partner, when bureaucratic inertia threatened to suffocate the mission. But every time a student from a neglected neighborhood scored high in a math contest, or got accepted to a top engineering program under the foundation's support, Zayden felt the weight lift, a tiny crack in a wall built to keep talent hidden. Slowly, more supporters came, retired teachers, sympathetic administrators from public schools, parents who believed their children deserved a chance. Word spread quietly, then steadily. 5 years after the scandal, BSF moved into its own building, a modest brick office lined with whiteboards, student artwork, framed letters of acceptance, and graphs showing upward trends in minority enrollment in advanced math and science programs. A banner hung in the entrance. "Potential does not discriminate." Denise's old keys, the yellow janitor's ring, sat in a glass case behind the reception desk, next to a plaque honoring her 20 years of service to Clearbrook High. Symbolic, but important. The plaque reminded visitors, some of the greatest contributors had once been invisible. Meanwhile, Clearbrook High itself had changed. The State Review Panel maintained oversight for several years. The honors program had been restructured, with external auditors reviewing grading and placement decisions. Scholarships and donor-linked guarantees were banned from influencing class assignments. Enrollment criteria were rewritten. Students were chosen on merit, not connection. In addition, the school's new STEM wing was funded by public grants allocated to low-income districts, the kind BSF had advocated for in its early white papers. The wing opened with a ceremony, and under the main entrance, a brass plaque was installed, reading, "Brooks STEM Center," in honor of Zayden Brooks. For the first time, the institution that once humiliated him bore his name, not as an apology, but as proof of change. Zayden visited on the opening day. He walked the hallways he once passed with tentative footsteps. He ran his fingers along the newly installed chalkboards in room 2 out. A few teachers nodded at him. Some students whispered, others just stared. He didn't seek applause. He only nodded back, calm. In his mind he saw every moment he hated. The stares, the suspicions, the dismissals. But now those memories felt like fuel, powering a future he was building for others. Students who once avoided him now signed up for tutoring, mentorship. A group of young Black and Latinx girls, middle schoolers from a neighboring district, visited for a summer workshop. Denise handed them notebooks, introduced them to calculus fundamentals, and watched them write problems as though they had always belonged. One of them looked at Zayden with bright eyes and said she wanted to be an aerospace engineer. He smiled, quietly, firmly, and told her she already had the space to begin. BSF expanded beyond math. It funded science fair projects, offered coding camps, paid for standardized test prep, and created mentorship programs, pairing students with STEM professionals. It also lobbied state legislatures to revise funding formulas, arguing that public schools in poorer districts deserved support equal to those in wealthy suburbs. For many, this felt like activism. For Zayden, it was justice. Years passed. The media profile of BESF rose. Profiles of children from janitor families turned STEM engineers filled newspapers. Alumni of the program spoke at conferences, accepted scholarships, published research. Their faces appeared in glossy magazine spreads, under headlines like "Hidden Genius Found in America's Forgotten Schools." The momentum built gradually, but steadily. Then came the unexpected twist. An anonymous leak, not from critics of BESF, but from a respected think tank that had long supported donor-based school funding, released internal documents claiming that BESF's model, while noble, disrupted local community school identities. They argued that wealthy suburbs funding their own labs and tutors fostered excellence, and that imposing equity could dilute standards. The leak painted BESF as a threat to educational heritage, and claimed the foundation's success stemmed not from merit, but from media hype. Social media erupted. Support passed from praises to heated debates. Old resentments, regrets, and fears rose once again, this time directed at Zayden and those he represented. The backlash was sudden. Donors to BESF withdrew support. Some partner schools pulled out of the program under pressure from local parents. The press renewed scrutiny, not of scandals but of fairness. Were scholarships being handed out freely, without accountability? Did the new STEM wing at Clearbrook unfairly advantage already strong students? Questions multiplied. The foundation's growth stalled. For the first time in years, Zayden and Denise found themselves defending not their innocence, but their mission. The night the leak broke, Zayden sat in the foundation office. Lights dim, the empty chairs around him heavy with expectation. Denise stood beside him, silent, watching as numbers dropped. Applications shrank, funding froze, partners hesitated. For a moment the weight of decades pressed again. Doubt clawed. Was the cycle starting over? Had they only exchanged one elite gate for another? But then from the stillness rose resolve. The next morning, BESF released an open letter, not in anger, but in transparency. They published their audited results, retention rates, demographic breakdowns, outcomes for alumni. They invited criticism, oversight, and cooperation. They acknowledged imperfections, funding shortfalls, administrative misfires, but also documented real, measurable progress. They reinstated outreach to low-income districts, offered full scholarships regardless of background, and created a board of trustees drawn from community leaders. Most importantly, they recommitted to the belief that merit belonged to everyone. Slowly, support returned. Teachers volunteered time, local businesses donated computer hardware, alumni funded summer stipends for students who couldn't afford commuting costs, and new students started enrolling the following year, ones whose parents never expected they'd even get a chance. The transformation reached its symbolic peak when a major national education conference invited BESF to present. On stage, Zayden stood not as a controversy, but as evidence, a living example that systemic change could work if performed with integrity and transparency. Teachers from across the country asked questions. Principals nodded. Policymakers scribbled notes. For the first time, reform wasn't just spoken of. It was modeled. Denise watched from the wings, eyes glistening unashamedly. There was pride in her stance, but also a calm satisfaction. The mop bucket, the early mornings, the erased college dreams. Every sacrifice had led here. The plaque at the school entrance, the scholarships, the dozens of accepted students. These were not victories for one family, but for generations. In the quiet months that followed, BESF updated its motto, "Where potential meets opportunity." They restructured to improve oversight, expanded nationwide, and launched a yearly fellowship program for former students, ensuring that those who once received help could pay it forward. The ripple grew into a wave. Schools in multiple states asked for partnership. State education boards began reviewing their placement policies. Parents once afraid to speak up now called for audits. The phrase legacy seat was slowly being replaced by merit seat. And yet, despite all that change, the world kept turning, and new challenges emerged. Funding cycles grew unpredictable. Opposition groups organized quietly. The fabric of privilege was woven deep, and unraveling it took more than lawsuits or speeches. It required constant vigilance, community support, and unwavering conviction. Then, one crisp morning, at a newly opened BESF school affiliate, in a southern state, a fresh face walked into a calculus classroom. She was 14, her skin a warm hue, her backpack old but clean, eyes bright with curiosity. The teacher, a man carrying the weight of legacy admissions and donor expectations, glanced up from his ledger and sneered, dismissively. He muttered something about not all kids are cut out for this, clearly targeting her background. His words echoed across time and place, a recycled prejudice aimed at a new generation. The girl didn't shrink. She simply lifted a worn copy of Zayden Brooks's autobiography, the one he had published 2 years earlier, chronicling his journey from janitor's son to national symbol. She flipped to the first page, smiled softly, and placed it on the desk as if offered evidence. In that moment, the classroom froze, not because of fear, because of recognition. The weight of history had shifted once more. A teacher's doubt met a student's resilience, and the balance tipped. That small act, not loud, not defiant, but firm and unyielding, carried a question across generations. What happens when talent meets opportunity, and legacy no longer defines worth? The ripple continued, and somewhere in the quiet turning of pages, a movement stirred again. A new student walks into a classroom. A teacher doubts her ability, but she opens Zayden's autobiography instead of shrinking. The challenge begins anew. If you believe no student should ever be judged by their parents' job, type yes in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Zayden's place that day? Don't forget to subscribe. We're telling the stories that too many try to silence, because every voice matters, and every injustice deserves to be seen.